Have you ever faced a situation where the people who claim to protect the neighborhood turned out to be the ones causing the biggest chaos? Imagine owning something you built with your own sweat and money, only for a group of people with too much power and too little common sense to try to tear it down. Now, imagine their plan backfiring so badly that they destroyed their own clubhouse instead. Sounds like a movie plot, right? Well, this is exactly what happened when an HOA tried to bulldoze my barn. But instead of getting rid of my property, they accidentally demolished their own headquarters. And trust me, the drama that followed was louder than the sound of that bulldozer. The battle begins. I had always been a quiet resident in my neighborhood. My property was on the edge of the community, and I had a barn that I used for small projects, tools, and sometimes just peace of mind. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. It had stood for years, painted red with white trim, looking like something out of an old countryside postcard. But apparently, the HOA board decided that my barn didn't fit the image of their picture-perfect neighborhood. At first, I thought it was a joke. They sent me letters filled with big words like violation, community standards, and non-compliance. According to them, my barn was an eyesore. Funny thing was, dozens of neighbors had sheds, playhouses, and even carports that were falling apart, but the board wasn't interested in those. No, they had their eyes locked on me. I tried reasoning with them. I explained that the barn was legal, permitted, and had been there long before most of them even moved in. But HOAs don't reason. They control. And when control doesn't work, they bully. Escalation. The threats kept coming. First it was fines. Then it was threats of legal action. Then came the letter saying they had the authority to remove any structure that violated community guidelines. That's when I realized this wasn't about a barn. It was about power. They wanted to make an example out of me. The crazy part? Many of my neighbors actually liked the barn. Kids would sometimes take photos near it during fall. Some older folks said it reminded them of simpler times. But the board didn't care about the people. They cared about their vision. The day of the bulldozer. I'll never forget that morning. The sound of heavy machinery roared down the street. I stepped outside and saw a massive bulldozer rolling toward my property. Behind it, HOA board members stood with smug smiles, clipboards in hand, ready to watch my barn come down. My heart pounded, but then something happened that I still laugh about to this day. The bulldozer operator, following the directions of the HOA board, took a wrong turn. Instead of driving into my yard, he turned toward the neighborhood clubhouse, the proud little building where the HOA held their meetings, parties, and rule-making sessions. Before anyone could stop him, the machine plowed right through the side of the clubhouse. Wood splintered, glass shattered, and the smug looks on the board members' faces vanished. The operator froze, realizing he had just ripped through the HOA's crown jewel. The board members started screaming, pointing fingers at each other, and rushing around in chaos. Meanwhile, I just stood there watching, stunned but secretly thrilled. Karma in action. The clubhouse wasn't just a small structure. It was the HOA's pride and joy. They had spent years collecting dues, charging fines, and bragging about how they built this community center. And in a matter of minutes, their own reckless decision had brought it crashing down. The irony was almost too perfect. They wanted to embarrass me, but they ended up embarrassing themselves. They wanted to destroy something I owned, but they destroyed something that belonged to them. And they wanted to prove their power, but they proved their incompetence instead. Neighbors came out from their houses, gathering to watch the scene. Some gasped in shock. Others couldn't hold back their laughter. A few even pulled out phones to record the mess. By the end of the day, the video of the HOA's accident had spread to the neighborhood like wildfire. Within hours, it was on social media. The whole town was laughing at them. The fallout, after the dust settled, literally, the HOA tried to cover up the disaster. They sent out official emails calling it an unfortunate incident and promising repairs. But nobody bought it. People knew the truth. They had seen the board's arrogance firsthand, and now they saw the result. The best part? They couldn't blame me. The bulldozer operator had followed their orders. They were the ones who brought in the heavy machinery. They were the ones who mismanaged the plan. I was just standing there, watching them destroy their own clubhouse. And here's where it got even better. Since the clubhouse was HOA property, repairs would have to come from HOA funds. That meant the board had essentially destroyed their own budget. Members started questioning the leadership, demanding answers about why the board was so focused on my barn instead of actual community issues. Lessons learned. What this taught me, and what I hope it teaches you, is simple. Sometimes you don't have to fight back with anger. Sometimes karma fights for you. When people abuse power, they often trip over their own arrogance. My barn still stands today, a little worn but still strong. The HOA, on the other hand, is still recovering from the disaster they brought on themselves. This whole story also reveals something bigger. HOAs are supposed to serve the community, not control it. But too often they forget that. They act like little governments, making rules to feed their egos. And when they go too far, they end up losing the trust of the very people they claim to protect. If you've ever dealt with an HOA, you know how frustrating it can be. But remember, you have rights, you have a voice, and sometimes life has a funny way of turning the tables. Don't be afraid to stand firm. And if you enjoyed this story of karma striking back in the most unexpected way, make sure to share it with someone who could use a laugh today. Stay tuned for the next part, where I'll reveal what happened after the clubhouse collapse, and how the community finally stood up to the HOA's bullying once and for all. Have you ever seen a powerful group fall apart from the inside? It's one thing when people lose a battle, but when pride, arrogance, and bad decisions bring down a whole organization, it's unforgettable. After the HOA's bulldozer destroyed their own clubhouse instead of my barn, the real story didn't stop there. In fact, that accident was just the beginning of their downfall. What followed was finger-pointing cover-ups and a rebellion from the very neighbors they once controlled. And believe me, the chaos that came afterward was even more entertaining than the demolition itself. Shockwaves through the community. The morning after the accident, the neighborhood was buzzing like a hive of angry bees. People who usually kept quiet about HOA business were suddenly talking nonstop. Some couldn't believe how reckless the board had been. Others were furious at their HOA fees, the money everyone paid every month, were about to be wasted fixing a clubhouse that didn't need to be destroyed in the first place. Emails flew back and forth. Text messages between neighbors were filled with screenshots of video. And at every mailbox, park bench, and dog walking trail, the conversation was the same. Did you see what happened? Can you believe they did that? The HOA had tried to make me the villain, but in less than 24 hours, the spotlight was fully on them. The board in panic mode. The HOA board called an emergency meeting, but of course, they had nowhere to meet. Their precious clubhouse was now missing half its walls and roof. So they awkwardly gathered in a neighbor's garage, trying to look professional, while sitting on folding chairs surrounded by bicycles and lawnmowers. They tried to spin the story. They said the accident was unfortunate, but insisted they were only doing their duty by enforcing community standards. The problem was nobody was buying it. Residents wanted answers. Who authorized the bulldozer? Who gave the order? And most importantly, why were they targeting one resident's barn when there were dozens of other issues in the neighborhood that actually needed attention? For once, the board wasn't in control of the narrative. The people were. Neighbors find their voice. One by one, neighbors who had stayed silent for years started speaking up. They talked about unfair fines, ignored complaints, and how the board seemed more interested in power trips than actual community improvement. The barn incident had lit a fire in people's hearts. Suddenly, folks realized they didn't have to be afraid anymore. An older gentleman stood up at one gathering and said, "They've been bullying us for years. But look what happened when they tried to bully one too many times. They destroyed their own clubhouse. That's not leadership. That's incompetence." His words sparked applause, and for the first time, the HOA board members looked nervous. The blame game begins. Inside the board, things got messy fast. Instead of taking responsibility, they started blaming each other. The president blamed the secretary for bad communication. The secretary blamed the treasurer for signing off without checking. The treasurer blamed the vice president for pushing too hard. And the vice president? He blamed the bulldozer operator. The operator, by the way, wasn't about to take the fall. He had paperwork that clearly showed he was hired by the HOA and given directions by them. Once that came out, it was obvious. The HOA had no one to blame but themselves. The barn stands strong. Meanwhile, my barn stood tall, untouched, and almost shining in the middle of the storm. Every time someone walked past it, they couldn't help but laugh at the irony. The very thing the HOA wanted gone was still standing, while their own pride and joy was a pile of rubble. Neighbors began to see my barn not as an eyesore, but as a symbol. It represented standing up against unfair rules. It represented resilience. And most of all, it represented karma. Some even joked about putting up a sign that read, "This barn outlasted the HOA Clubhouse." Community rebellion. Within weeks, residents organized. They demanded a special vote to remove certain board members. Petitions were signed. Meetings were packed. For the first time, the board couldn't hide behind rules or fine letters. They had to face real people, and those people were angry. I didn't even have to lead the charge. The community did it on their own. All I had to do was show up and watch. It was like watching dominoes fall, one by one. Board members either resigned or were voted out. Their arrogance had finally caught up with them, and they had no defense left. The turning point. The biggest turning point came when the financial report was revealed. It turned out the HOA had already been struggling with money. And now, with the cost of repairing the demolished clubhouse, they were facing a huge financial hole. Nobody wanted their dues to go up just to cover the board's mistake. That sealed the deal. People realized something powerful. The HOA wasn't invincible. They weren't untouchable. They were just a group of neighbors with titles. And when they abused those titles, they could be removed just as quickly as they were elected. A new beginning. By the end of the year, the HOA board was completely restructured. New members were voted in, people who actually care about the neighborhood and didn't let power go to their heads. Instead of focusing on barns, they focused on fixing potholes, cleaning up parks, and creating real community events. As for me, I finally had peace. No more threatening letters. No more early morning bulldozers. Just me, my barn, and a neighborhood that had learned a valuable lesson about standing up against unfair authority. The symbol of change. The barn became more than just a structure on my property. It became a story people told new neighbors. Did you hear about the time the HOA tried to bulldoze that barn and ended up destroying their own clubhouse? It was almost like folklore passed from one resident to another, and every time someone mentioned it, they smiled. Because deep down, everyone loves a story where the bully loses and the underdog wins. The lesson for everyone. This story isn't just about me. It's about anyone who's ever been pushed around by people who think they have more power than they really do. It's about reminding ourselves that sometimes the best revenge is just letting arrogance destroy itself. The HOA tried to take something from me, but they ended up taking everything from themselves. And that's a lesson worth remembering. When people lead with pride instead of wisdom, they almost always trip over their own feet. So here's my message to you. If you've ever felt small against a big organization, don't give up. Stand your ground. You might not have a bulldozer to expose their arrogance, but you do have truth, patience, and the support of people who know right from wrong. And if this story made you laugh, inspired you, or reminded you of your own HOA nightmares, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the best way to fight back is simply telling the story loud enough that nobody can ignore it.